why are we here? Or can I have a relationship with God? These kinds of things I can't measure with my microscope or my telescope.
Hope deranges us. Hope breaks things and breaks things down.
Christianity isn't some kind of self-help doctrine. It's not probiotics for the soul or something, you know?
He was using the parable of the Good Samaritan to justify bombing Syria.
Welcome to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. I'm Simon Smart. Well, something a bit different this week. Our friends at Theos Think Tank in London also produce a podcast called The Sacred. It's really interesting, great conversations about how we conduct our public debates and engage with people who are different from us. Elizabeth Oldfield has been on our Life and Faith podcast, as has her colleague Nick Spencer. Well, she is the host and interviewer, and today we are, with Theos's blessing, bringing you Elizabeth's conversation with British author and journalist Christina Patterson. Christina Patterson is a former columnist at The Independent and now works as a freelance writer for a number of publications, writing about culture, society, politics and books. In 2018, she published her book, The Art of Not Falling Apart. It's a memoir about surviving life in the 21st century. Christina Patterson is someone who left an evangelical Christian faith as a young woman and has some interesting things to say about that experience, and also about the ups and downs of life, including major health battles, being retrenched from work, and life as a writer. Here's Elizabeth Oldfield, Director of Theos Think Tank in London.
Christina, I'm going to kick off with a really big, meaty question that I ask everyone to try and think about, that some people find very easy and some people find very difficult. Having had a little bit of time to reflect, do you have a sense of what your sacred values are? The things that you try and live by, the principles that when those are threatened, you feel quite compromised and you react quite strongly to that?
Yes, I would say fundamentally it's about truth and kindness and integrity and public service. My father was deeply honourable man, so honourable that when we used to come back from summer holidays in Sweden, he would stop off at customs and try to declare the furniture he'd bought from IKEA, which nobody else thought you had to do, and indeed you didn't have to do. But he was so law-abiding that he felt he really took it to quite an extreme. And that's how I was brought up, and with the belief that what's more important than anything is how you behave on this planet, not what you achieve.
And tell me a bit more about your childhood. That's really helpful to hear about your father. What were the kind of formative ideas from him or elsewhere in the air, whether they were philosophical or religious or political, that you think have helped shape who you are today?
Well, my father and mother we went to church. We went to an Anglican church. My father kept a prayer book on his bedside table. And we did have to go to church every Sunday until I rebelled against that. Nobody talked about religion at home, although when I was little, I remember my mother was Swedish. She would say prayers in Swedish with us. So I certainly was brought up as a child to believe in the Christian story, and more importantly, the Christian values of, the ones you might sum up in 1 Corinthians 13. And so that was really, really fundamental. But on top of that, both my parents and in fact my entire extended family worked in public service. So my mother was a teacher, my father was a civil servant, my aunt was a social worker, I won't go through every single member of my family, but essentially nobody made any money by doing anything kind of entrepreneurial or in business. And I was absolutely brought up to believe that you were here to contribute to society. That's what life was for, really, and to be a kind and compassionate and thoughtful human being. So when I was doing an MA in literature at University of East Anglia, sitting around reading George Eliot and Derrida and Barthes and so on, my father wrote me a slightly fierce letter on blue Basildon bond paper, and at the head of the letter in block capitals were the words "on rendering unto Caesar." And what followed was essentially a kind of "when the hell are you going to get a job, darling" letter, but it was put much more sternly than that. It was about the duty of the citizen to pay taxes and contribute to society. And as someone who had already had the huge privilege of doing a degree and now of doing a further degree. I had already been subsidised by taxpayers who would never have the opportunity for that kind of education. And essentially, it was time for me to take responsibility and make sure that I contribute to society, not just through work that was, meaningful, but literally by paying taxes. So that was absolutely the core of my value system. And on top of that, my mother, having come from Sweden, was really from social democracy, and the belief was that we should all be fighting for equality of opportunity and fiercely anti-private schools. I'm very much centre ground these days, but I still believe very, very strongly that it's a really bad way to run a society when 7% of the population get creamed off into kind of elite education. So I suppose those values were really about fairness, honesty, integrity, kindness, and public duty. I remember at university meeting someone who said to me, well, the point in life is to get on, isn't it? And I was thunderstruck. I was naively thunderstruck because it had literally never occurred to me that was what you were here for. I was absolutely brought up to believe that you were here to serve.
Tell me about the moment when you came to rebel then, because you've talked about going to church every Sunday. What changed?
Oh, Camus, Sartre, all that stuff. And age 13, I was reading French literature, and we had quite a bohemian French teacher, and I was also reading sort of romantic thrillers like Mary Stuart, and I just thought, well, this is clearly nonsense, isn't it? And as someone of brooding intensity and integrity, I can't possibly say words I don't believe. So I would stand in church stonily, not saying the words to any of the prayers or singing the hymns, until my parents, I think, sort of dying of embarrassment, said, "It's all right, Christina, you don't have to go anymore." So that was that really. But then I had a rebellion on the other side, which I can tell you about if you like.
So you weren't out of church for that long, I gather. What drew you back in?
Tragically, what drew me back in was adolescence, puberty, and wanting to meet boys. So having gone to a girls' grammar school that then turned comprehensive, my girls' grammar school was no longer paired off with the boys' grammar school, which my brother went to, because that went independent. So the independent boys' school was then paired off with the local girls' private school. And my school had no school to be paired off with. So there was a huge shortage of boys. And when a friend of my brother's invited him to a local youth club, my brother said that I could come too, and my best friend Louise. So we went along, not quite realising that it was attached to a Baptist church. And there were all these very cool-looking boys in their leather jackets, all with motorbikes. And we thought, wow, we've arrived in heaven. But what we didn't realise was that there was a whole Baptist infrastructure surrounding it. And soon we were invited to go along to church. We went to church. It was a church called Millmead in Guildford. There was a very, very charismatic, in both senses of the word, charismatic personality-wise, and also charismatic in terms of the then movement of the so-called gifts of the Holy Spirit. So I got sucked into that, and I was then a Baptist, evangelical Christian fundamentalist, I suppose you could say, until my mid-20s, until I was 26.
How do you think that season of your life has formed you? What did it leave you with?
It left me very scarred, actually, very, very scarred. I had a very difficult time. I had a sister who had schizophrenia, who had huge struggles in her life. And whether or not it's coincidence, I don't know, but I began to develop physical problems of my own. When I was 25, I developed strange pains in my wrists, and then my ankles spread up to my knees. And by the time I was 26, I was literally crippled and unemployed and helpfully a virgin, because unfortunately, as soon as I'd gone near the boys, I was then told we weren't allowed to touch the boys because you weren't allowed to do anything unless you were married, which we weren't. So it was very tough. And at my church and in my house groups and Bible study, everyone kept saying, the Lord wants to heal you. And there was I, 25 and then 26, in terrible pain with a very limited life, begging out to God to heal me, as I understood the Bible had promised that he would. And nothing happened. And I got more and more traumatized by the whole thing, actually, so that in the end, there were all kinds of things going on in my family. My poor sister had a washing up job in a local canteen, which she lost. My brother was suffering from depression. And I just cracked. And I thought, I didn't actually lose my faith. I hated God. And in my diary, I wrote one day, I won't quote the language, but I basically told him to F off. And that was that.
What would you call yourself now? Are you still in a place where you didn't lose your faith, but you hate him, or?
No, no, I don't still hate
How would you
God.
self-describe?
As an atheist, actually, as an atheist. Yeah. I don't believe in a God, but I do believe that human beings are hardwired for religious belief and storytelling. And I do believe that it's a very deep instinct in us to want to make sense of things in those ways. And I also now have quite a lot of sympathy for the Anglicanism of my childhood, which is still the Anglicanism of a lot of churches in this country, which I think is pretty inclusive, pretty tolerant, very much a lot of the time about values rather than ideology. And I think that's actually the values that come out of that, which are of, generally speaking, of kindness, are very good values. So I'm much less intolerant of religion now than I used to be, but I'm very worried by fundamentalism.
I'm just really sad to hear about that story. I've read about it a little bit because you've written beautifully about that experience. And it's interesting for me personally because I have an almost identical story, and that I didn't come from a vaguely Christian background, sort of culturally so, but certainly not personally. And then was not interested in church at all, and then was invited to a youth group because of the boys, and then to a Christian festival because of the boys.
Which one?
Soul Survivor.
Oh, I've not heard of that one.
Yeah. And spent the whole week there, not going anywhere near the tent where the crazy people were speaking in tongues, but, hanging around the skate park. But then on the last day, prayed, God, if you're real, would you show me? And have a very powerful, charismatic experience, which when I think about my life is a real turning point. And although in lots of ways, intellectually, I've taken my faith apart and had a period of being an atheist, and there's lots of areas of that tribe that I wouldn't necessarily feel deep affinity with now. There's lots of areas where I would. When I look back on it, it feels to me like it was very psychologically protective for me at that period in my life, because feeling like there was someone outside my group of friends whose approval and acceptance of me was not determined on whether I was too tall or too fat or too attractive or too clever, but that fundamentally I was loved and that wasn't going to change. I look at my diaries before that point and the diaries after, and I was radically happier and continued to find great psychological health and wholeness in that. And so reading your story, one, it just made me really sad and has got me thinking about the way a very similar set of ideas can land in different people in completely different ways, and handled, taught in slightly different ways can have an enormous impact on people's lives. So I guess it's really helpful to hear that your early Anglicanism, the kind of the value there is sort of coming into focus again. You've also written beautifully about the Bible and that period of your life, leaving you with a kind of literary imprint. Do you mind saying a bit more about that?
Yes. I mean, I've always been a huge reader. Actually, strangely, during my Christian years, those were the years when I read the least literature. I read lots of so-called Christian books, which were kind of, essentially very dramatic stories about conversion, like, the cross and the switchblade, yes. or I can't remember.
The one about the dragon.
From witchcraft to Christ, yes. Things like that. All very, very dramatic, sorry. But the Bible was in me anyway because of my childhood. And actually the translations of the Bible that I read in my evangelical Christian years, I suppose largely New International Version and the Good News Version, which is pretty banal in terms of there's not much poetry in it. The whole of Western literature is infused with the Bible, and so is the whole of Western art. So if you don't know anything about the Bible, you are going to miss layers and layers of richness and complexity in literature and art, but also the poetry of it, the rhythms of it, the poetry of it. And I think you heard, I was doing a podcast the other day when Mark McGuinness, who was interviewing me, asked me about somehow the Bible came up. And I realized that I have a sort of use rhetorical repetition quite a lot in my writing. And it's kind of a recognizable characteristic. And I've had the odd sub-editor over the years who said, I think you could cut that repetition. And I've thought, no, I absolutely want that repetition in there because that's kind of, the poetry of it. And I think probably a lot of that does come from the Bible.
Talk to me about that thread then, because you've had a fascinating and just a career that sounds like an enormous amount of fun in kind of various bits of the literary world and the Poetry Society, and then quite late in comparison going into journalism as a columnist. What's the thread, what's the pull, what's the vocation that's led you through that?
That's such an interesting question. I think it's funny because I think I always wanted to be a writer, of course, but I never thought I could. And actually that was part of my public service upbringing, was that sense that that writing was a bit kind of kooky and, kind of self-indulgent, actually. So I initially went into publishing, and then I went into arts admin, which was fascinating. And I met and worked with lots of fascinating writers, some of the world's top writers, some, of the 20th century, some of whom have died since, when I worked in my years at the South Bank Centre and then running the Poetry Society. And I really loved those jobs. They were very, very interesting. But the only way, and I suppose studying, having done a degree in literature and then an MA in literature, I lost any belief that I could write creatively myself, because I thought there's a whole world literature out there. How could one possibly have the hubris to add to it? But what I did do from about the age of 25 was I reviewed other people's work. So I did book reviews, for about 15 years, and the odd interview and the odd feature. And then I was approached by the literary editor of The Independent to say, he said his deputy was leaving and would I like to apply for the role? And at that point, I was running the Poetry Society and loving it and thinking, oh no, I don't know that I want to leave this lovely job to essentially go and open jiffy bags somewhere else. But I also thought, this is it. You won't get another chance to work on a national paper. So I took the opportunity and I started off as deputy literary editor and then eventually wrote a column twice a week and became a full-time writer. I suppose the thread, it's difficult when people ask about threads, because vocation is, most people don't have the luxury of a vocation, actually. And of course, we would all love to earn a living by doing the thing we adore. But if the thing you adore is being a Premier League footballer or a film star, then you're probably going to have to recognise quite early that's not going to happen. And even doing something you quite enjoy is sort of a luxury of certain tranches of the Western world. So I wouldn't want to be precious about that. But I do think that, generally speaking, we are happiest in life when we feel that we are making the most of our talents. And I suppose I feel that the thing that I love doing most, I mean, it's sort of quite painful at the time, but to have done it, is writing from your heart about stuff that is interesting. So I'm interested in pretty much everything. I'm, mad about art and literature and poetry, but I'm also obsessed with politics and current affairs and society. I'm luckily not at all interested in sport, so I can, not engage with that at all. But the rest of it I am interested in. So I would say really the kind of vocation bit is about curiosity. It's about looking and trying to understand and trying to analyse and trying to formulate thoughts. So really it's about ideas. And for me, actually, it all comes back to the Keats thing about beauty and truth in Ode on a Grecian Urn. I think that sort of covers everything, really. If you feel that you are seeking the truth, whatever that means to you, and the beauty is both looking for the beauty in life and also trying to create something beautiful in the process.
If you're confused, you are listening to Life and Faith, but this week we're bringing you something a bit different. It's Theos Think Tank's podcast, The Sacred, and Elizabeth Oldfield's conversation with author and journalist Christina Patterson.
I wanted to ask about, in your life post deciding you weren't a Christian, what are the rituals or the ideas or the practices that have helped you build meaning? And is there anything else you have drawn strength from, or meaning or solace outside religion that you might call spiritual or not?
Literature, poetry. I think for me, the nearest, in some ways, I get to a spiritual experience is when I'm reading a really great piece of literature or a really great poem, and it just hits you here and you think, this is what life is like. And then making profound connections with other humans and feeling that you are listening and being heard and understanding and being understood. And essentially that you are not alone and that other people are not alone. I wrote a book which came out last year, and in some ways I think the main reason I wrote it was to make people who suffer feel less alone. That was kind of, even in my Christian years when I was going through a terrible time, I wanted to write a book that would help people cope with the suffering in their lives. But obviously, I wasn't Jesus, so I couldn't write the Bible, but not that Jesus did write the Bible. But so I think it's that connection really. And that feels like a kind of truth, seeing truth, hearing it, the joy, the absolute joy of seeing humanity at its best, seeing a beautiful landscape, nature, a flower. For me, I get a huge amount of pleasure out of a glass of wine. I love drink, I love wine, I love crisps. So I would say the nearest I get to a religious ritual in my life is probably sitting down for a delicious glass of wine and some kettle chip.
There's something sacramental in it.
It's my version of the communion, yes.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the book because one of the things that I find challenging in our public conversations is it feels like vulnerability is something of a taboo. And the sort of kind of success-based living, best foot forward, slightly spun version of ourselves as personal brands or as organizations, or as political parties or whatever it is, makes complete sense in a kind of competitive logic, but is not at all true to the human experience, and I think quite damaging for how we feel about ourselves. So how easy was it for you to write a book that's essentially about vulnerability and failure and picking yourself up again after crises? What was the journey of that?
Well, it did feel exposing, obviously, and it is very exposing because I talk about some very personal stuff and some, what felt like a lot of failures in a lot of areas. But I suppose one of the things you learn in life is that literally everybody suffers, literally everybody experiences embarrassment or mortification. Most people feel that they fail in many ways. Successful people feel a bit of a fraud. Very successful people usually feel that they have failed because to be that driven, you generally have to feel that you have failed in order to drive yourself further. And I suppose partly I've had cancer twice. I'm intensely aware that life is short and I can't really be bothered to mess around anymore. So if anyone is going to laugh at me for exposing myself, that's fine. It's fine. I would rather be honest. And I know that many people experience the things I've written about. So I don't really find that embarrassing. And I think it would be helpful if people were more honest. I don't mean that we should all be in some great, kind of therapy-a-thon where we're all sitting around weeping and talking about how terrible we feel. I don't think that's necessarily helpful. I think even sometimes talking about how we feel isn't necessarily helpful. Sometimes you're better off just having a bit of a laugh with a friend and talking about something else or going to see a good film or something. But I do think, without getting into the B word, which is consuming every waking moment for me and a lot of other people in the country at the moment, I think more honesty would have taken us to a different place. And I think honesty about complexity is generally better. I think if people understand that things are complicated and difficult, they are more patient and understanding than if you pretend that they're simple. And very few things in life are simple. I mean, my book is generally found in the self-help section of bookshops, but it isn't a self-help book. If anything, it's a kind of anti-self-help book. And in as far as there is a message, which there isn't really, because it's all about a layering of stories and meaning, it is that literally every human being finds their own way through the challenges and complexities of life. And there are certain consistent threads which may or may not be helpful if you are suffering in particular ways. But if only life could be reduced to a PowerPoint slide or a political manifesto or a slogan that wins a referendum, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
Talk to me about writing personally, and you do in the book and elsewhere write about grief and loss and cancer and singleness and all these issues that so many of us have experienced. It strikes me as in a moment where the media is in real crisis and you're no longer paid by a paper, but a freelance journalist are there pressures for people to be more personal than they would naturally want to in order to kind of build a personal brand or to carve out space in a noisy world? And have you experienced that? Do you worry about it?
I think there probably are pressures in that direction. I think there is a sort of, there has been a very worrying shift towards narcissism, and I think that's been exacerbated by social media and this whole idea that you are a brand and have to push yourself as a brand. And the horrible truth is that now you kind of do. If you don't have any followers on Twitter, for example, you're going to be challenged to find a publisher if you want to have a book out or things like that. So I think up to a point, you have to play that game. In terms of the writing, exposing stuff, I mean, I don't think I'm the most interesting thing in the whole world. I think the world is very interesting. I find what's happening in Westminster at the moment infinitely more interesting than anything that's gone on in my own head ever. I only write about things that are personal when I'm confident that I can control the way that will appear. I wouldn't want someone else to write that because, well, I mean, I'm not so precious that, people can write what they like, but I only do it if I think, yeah, that's okay. If it feels sort of okay-ish. I mean, I was a bit alarmed. I wrote a piece about being single for the Mail a couple of years ago, and the headline said, Christina Patterson been single for 51 years. And I thought, I don't think I popped out of the womb as a kind of spinster. I think allow me maybe 20 years when I'm not classified by whether or not I'm, with a bloke or not. So I did find that rather irritating, I have to say. And you don't have control over headlines. And I do, and I have been asked to write personal things that I won't do. In fact, I was asked recently to write a piece about a very personal piece, and I said no. I mean, I do say no quite a lot, but I think there is a pressure in that direction, yes. And actually, the thing I would add to that is a degree of sexism, which is, I think, as a woman, you are much more pressurized to write that kind of piece. I would rather be writing about politics now, but if someone wants a piece about me being single or what it's like to be single, I'll do it, because that's also, I think, a third of the population is now single. So I think it's a significant societal phenomenon, and one that's worth thinking about and engaging with from a non-narcissistic viewpoint. But it does irritate me that the blokes get to write about the Westminster Village and the girls get to write about, makeup or whatever.
It does feel like, and I found it on the podcast as well, that there's something, and I think this doesn't work for either of us, that men have been socialized to find it more difficult to talk about themselves and to reflect on their own values and their own story, and often see kind of facts and evidence as disembodied things away from that. Whereas I think women find it both easier to talk about themselves and reflect personally in public, but then sometimes put in boxes of being, hysterical or self-concerned. So I don't know what this kind of healthy middle ground is, where we acknowledge our embodiedness and our stories and our perspective and our lenses and the things that have shaped us, without making that primary, because the cult of personality is no good either. Right? I want to ask a final question, which is about how we speak across difference, and just anything general that you've learnt from that. And then if you're willing, specifically about the belief, non-belief debate, are there things that you'd like Christians to do differently or to do better when they engage with people who wouldn't call themselves believers?
On difference and non-difference, you have to listen. You have to give each other the space to speak and be heard. But you also, generally speaking, have to accept that you're not very likely to change the other person's mind. And then I think you have to construct, as we have in our society, a sort of legal system that shows that there are lines that can't be crossed. And I do think that when we had the rise of multiculturalism and so on, quite a few mistakes were made. I wrote a column in 2010, and the hook was the fact that there hadn't been a single prosecution about FGM. And I talked about the headline was The Limits of Multiculturalism. And I was strongly attacked for Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And in fact, I was nominated by the Simon Wiesenthal Centre for one of the top 10 anti-Semitic slurs of 2010, which was horrible. And for ages, the first thing, if you Googled me, that came up was anti-Semitism. It was on my Wikipedia entry. It was absolutely horrible. I had a migraine for 2 weeks. And, I think anyone who knows me knows I'm not anti-Semitic. And plus the editor and the deputy editor who published that column and really liked it were both Jewish. So it would have been rather strange.
Do you mind me just clarifying, was it because you spoke about circumcision as well? For
No,
baby
it
boys?
was because I talked about, for example, when a 7-year-old Hasidic Jewish boy sits next to me when I sit next to him on the bus, and he stands up and recoils in case he touches you, in case you're menstruating, and things like that. The kind of different cultural practices which can result in sexism and homophobia and all kinds of things that are counter to values that we fought very hard to enshrine in our society. And I think as a result of mistakes that were made in those years, particularly on the left, actually, all kinds of behaviour and practices that aren't compatible with our society were allowed to continue and even flourish. And that has created problems. And I think that has contributed to what you could call racism and sort of bad race relations, and even one could argue to some of the Islamic fundamentalism that has arisen out of, aggression, misunderstanding or whatever. I think listening always has to be the starting point. But I think ultimately a society has to establish what is, there has to be a legal system that establishes what is acceptable and what isn't. So we know that it isn't acceptable to have, kind of home educate your children and tell them that it is absolutely wrong to have a homosexual relationship or whatever. So there are lines. It is very difficult, though, because if you believe something very, very passionately and the other person doesn't, it's natural to have a human instinct to want to change that person's belief. And I think it's absolutely fine to have an argument about that, as in an intellectual argument about that. But the truth is, and we've certainly discovered this through the whole Brexit experience, is that arguments don't generally change very much. These things happen at a different level, at an emotional level. And the other question you asked, which was about Christians' advice, well, actually, I do know somebody quite close to me who has a habit, who is an evangelical Christian, and who has a habit of writing huge letters to people who don't share his belief, that are expressing his religious views, which is entirely inappropriate. And I think everybody's entitled to their views, but I think you do also have to think, is this going to be kind or not kind? And ultimately, I think what guides us really ought to be about kindness and not doing harm to other people. And it isn't a sensible thing to consistently try to impose your beliefs on other people who don't share them.
I think that one's a really difficult one to square, that I've gone round and round, because I think probably the letter writer would say the ultimate kindness is, offering this thing that I believe is most life-giving and good and true and beautiful thing. And that's just not you're not going to get an agreement on that.
No.
So how we navigate that, particularly in kind of service provider is always called proselytism, and religious people tend to call witness or evangelism, is I think one of the things that we as a society need to work out very carefully as we go forward. Balance. There's a wonderful book called The Ethics of Evangelism, which
interesting.
Some of that. So I think religious communities are wrestling with how you have difficult conversations, because without difficult conversations, we're just ignoring our differences, aren't we? But in ways that are kind and honest and humble.
And respectful to the other person's beliefs.
Yes, indeed. Christina, thank you so much for talking to me today on The Sacred.
Thank you for having me as your guest. I've really enjoyed it.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Today we've been listening to The Sacred podcast from Theos Think Tank in London, talking to author and journalist Christina Patterson. If you'd like more material from them, just search The Sacred podcast in your podcast app. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Next week, Natasha speaks with Dennis Alexander.
What we have is a sort of package deal, so that all the good stuff and all the, if you like, bad stuff we don't like, just go together. Okay, so if you have carbon-based life, you're going to get carbon-based death. That's the way it's going to go. If you are going to live as we are in this particular world, you need pain receptors. If you don't have pain receptors, you're going to die quite soon, because you won't know that you're walking around with a broken leg or, munching on glass or something.